I thought my mother-in-law's invitation for dinner was nothing more than a kind gesture. But that night, as the wine flowed and her loneliness unfolded, the boundaries of our relationship blurred in ways I never imagined. A chance meeting in a dimly lit hallway changed everything. Her gaze held something I couldn't ignore, and before I knew it, my world was spiraling into a web of secrets I might never escape. Her vulnerability struck me in a way I couldn't explain. As the evening wore on, I found myself drawn to her, not as my mother-in-law, but as a woman who carried strength and sorrow in equal measure. That night, something shifted between us, though I couldn't yet grasp what it was. All I knew was that the simplicity of our relationship had been replaced by a complex and unsettling tension. The dinner with Laura lingered in my mind far longer than I expected. The warmth of her laughter, the way her eyes softened as she spoke of her loneliness, it all played back in my head, stirring emotions I didn't fully understand. I convinced myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of connection between two people seeking solace in their respective loneliness. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the tension that had settled over me. Emma's absence felt heavier than usual. She called sporadically, her voice distant as she spoke of her time with friends. "Everything okay at home?" she'd ask, her tone more out of obligation than genuine concern. I'd reassure her, hiding the unease growing inside me. Laura began calling more frequently after that night, her voice carrying a subtle warmth that hadn't been there before. She'd ask how I was doing, mention that she was thinking of me, and invite me over for coffee or a quick chat. Her gestures seemed innocent, but I couldn't ignore the way my pulse quickened whenever her name lit up my phone. One evening, she invited me over again, this time for no particular reason. "I just made a pot of stew," she said lightly. "It's far too much for one person. Come keep me company." I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the decline button. But something drew me to her, something I couldn't define. I told myself it was harmless, a kind act for someone who had shown me nothing but warmth and hospitality. When I arrived, the house was filled with the comforting aroma of her cooking, and her smile was as inviting as ever. The evening felt easy at first. We talked about mundane things, the weather, Emma's career, Laura's plans for redecorating the living room. But as the night wore on and the wine flowed, the conversation turned deeper. She spoke of her late husband, of the life they built together and the void his absence had left. Her voice wavered slightly, and I found myself leaning in, drawn to her vulnerability. There was a moment, a pause in the conversation, when our eyes met. It was fleeting but electric, like a current passing between us. I quickly looked away, trying to focus on anything else. But the air in the room had shifted, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us acknowledged. I left soon after, my thoughts racing as I drove home. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was overthinking things. But the memory of her gaze, of the way her hand had lingered on mine for just a second too long, refused to leave me. Emma returned home the next day, her demeanor unchanged. She was cheerful but detached, her attention focused on recounting her trip rather than asking about my time alone. As she spoke, I found myself studying her, searching for signs that she might sense the growing conflict within me. But she remained oblivious, her laughter filling the room while my own chuckle felt hollow. Over the next few weeks, the tension only grew. Laura and I continued to speak, though I tried to limit our interactions. Yet every conversation, every passing glance during family gatherings, seemed to carry an undertone I couldn't ignore. I began avoiding eye contact, afraid that she might see the confusion and guilt swirling in my mind. Emma, however, wasn't completely unaware. One night, as I arrived home later than usual, she asked casually, "Late night at work again?" Her tone was light, but her eye searched mine for answers I didn't have. "Yeah," I replied quickly, avoiding her gaze. "Things have been hectic lately." But her expression lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. Did she suspect something? Could she feel the shift between us, even if she didn't yet know its source? The doubts in my mind grew louder, threatening to consume me. I told myself it was nothing, that I could stop it all before it went any further. But deep down, I knew the truth, something had been set in motion, something that couldn't easily be undone. I tried to create distance between Laura and me, to bury the feelings that had begun to surface. But no matter how much I resisted, circumstances seemed to conspire against me. Family gatherings, casual calls, and unexpected visits kept drawing us together, each encounter charged with an unspoken tension neither of us dared to address. It was like trying to hold back a tide, inevitable and relentless. One evening, Emma had gone out with friends, leaving me alone in our apartment. I had planned to spend the night catching up on work, but a text from Laura changed everything. "I made too much pasta again. Would you like to come over and help me finish it? I could use the company." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. I knew I should decline, that going over there would only deepen the complexity of our situation. But the loneliness I felt, and the strange pull I couldn't ignore, won out. When I arrived, Laura greeted me warmly, her smile both comforting and disarming. She wore a casual dress that somehow made her seem even more graceful. "I didn't want to eat alone," she said softly, leading me to the dining table. "It's nice to have someone to talk to." We ate, laughed, and shared stories, the evening feeling deceptively normal. But beneath the surface, an unspoken tension lingered, growing heavier with every passing moment. As the night wore on, Laura poured us both a second glass of wine. She spoke about her late husband again, her voice tinged with sadness and longing. "I miss him," she said, her gaze distant. "Not just as a partner, but as someone who made me feel seen." Her words struck a chord in me. I understood that feeling all too well, the longing to be noticed, to be appreciated. Emma's growing detachment had left me craving something I couldn't quite articulate, and Laura's vulnerability seemed to mirror my own. I looked at her, seeing not just my mother-in-law, but a woman who had endured so much, who carried herself with strength despite the loneliness that weighed her down. "I see you," I said quietly, the words escaping before I could stop them. Her eyes met mine, wide with surprise and something else, something deeper. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with meaning. Then she reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, igniting feelings I had been desperately trying to suppress. "I should go," I said abruptly, pushing my chair back and standing up. "Mark," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You don't have to." Her words stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look at her, and the expression on her face, a mix of fear, hope, and vulnerability, tore down the last of my defenses. Before I knew it, I had crossed the space between us. Her hand found mine, and in that moment, the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of us. The first kiss was tentative, almost hesitant, but it quickly deepened. The months of unspoken tension, of stolen glances and suppressed emotions, erupted in a wave of passion neither of us could control. It was wrong, I knew that, but in that instant, nothing else mattered. She wasn't my mother-in-law, she was Laura, a woman who understood my loneliness in a way no one else could. We spent the rest of the evening together, the barriers we had clung to crumbling completely. But as the night gave way to morning, reality began to set in. I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window, the weight of what we'd done pressing down on me like a physical force. Laura sat at the edge of the bed, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with sadness. I nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I know. We can't do this," she said after a long silence. "It's not fair to Emma. It's not fair to us." I wanted to argue, to tell her that what we had was real, that it wasn't just a mistake. But the guilt I felt was too strong. I nodded again, my throat tight. "You're right," I said, though the words felt like a betrayal of everything we'd shared. We agreed to keep the night a secret, to pretend it had never happened. But even as I left her house, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The feelings we had unleashed couldn't be buried so easily. They lingered, haunting me in the quiet moments when I was alone. Over the following weeks, Laura and I tried to avoid each other. But the pull between us was undeniable. Every family gathering, every accidental brush of hands, every stolen glance served as a painful reminder of what we had shared and what we could never have again. The secret Laura and I shared hung over me like a storm cloud, growing heavier with each passing day. I told myself it was over, that what had happened was a fleeting mistake born from loneliness and vulnerability. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the memories of that night with her lingered, infiltrating my thoughts in the quiet hours when I was alone. The guilt was suffocating, yet the pull to see her again was equally undeniable. Laura, too, seemed to struggle with our shared secret. At family gatherings, her demeanor was carefully composed, but I noticed the fleeting glances she threw my way, the way her voice softened when she spoke to me. It was subtle, but I could feel the weight of her emotions, mirroring my own turmoil. Emma, thankfully, seemed oblivious, too caught up in her work and social life to notice the growing tension between her mother and me. But secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply they're buried. One evening, Laura called me. Her voice was calm but carried a note of finality. "Mark, we need to talk. Can you come over?" I hesitated, my heart pounding. I knew what she was going to say, that we couldn't continue like this, that we needed to put distance between us for the sake of everyone involved. And yet, I found myself agreeing. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, hanging up before I could second-guess myself. When I arrived, Laura met me at the door. She looked tired, as though the weight of our secret had drained her. "Come in," she said softly, leading me to the living room. She gestured for me to sit, and we faced each other in a silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. "I can't keep doing this," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Every time I see Emma, I feel like I'm betraying her in the worst way. She's my daughter, Mark. How did we let this happen?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I don't know," I admitted. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I don't know how to stop feeling this way." Laura's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We have to stop. For Emma's sake, for both of us. This isn't just about what we want, it's about what's right." I nodded, though the thought of letting go felt unbearable. "You're right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep doing this." As I stood to leave, a voice behind me froze me in place. "What can't you keep doing?" I turned slowly, my heart sinking as I saw Emma standing in the doorway. Her expression was a mixture of confusion and hurt, her eyes darting between Laura and me. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice rising. Neither Laura nor I spoke, the weight of her question hanging heavily in the room. Emma stepped closer, her gaze sharp and searching. "Mark? Mom? What is this?" It's not what you think," I stammered, my mind racing for an explanation. But the words wouldn't come. Emma's eyes narrowed. "Then what is it?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the two of you are hiding something." Laura stood, her hands trembling. "Emma, please, it's not." "Don't," Emma interrupted, her voice breaking. "Don't lie to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Laura and I exchanged a look, and in that moment, I knew there was no point in trying to hide the truth. Emma deserved better than half-truths and evasion. She deserved to know. "Emma," I began, my voice shaking, "something happened between your mom and me." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Emma's face crumpled, her confusion giving way to shock and devastation. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you saying?" "I'm so sorry," Laura said, her voice breaking. "It was a mistake, a horrible mistake. It never should have happened." Emma stepped back, as though the weight of the revelation was too much to bear. "A mistake," she repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. "You're my husband." "And you," she turned to Laura, her voice rising. "You're my mother. How could you? How could either of you do this to me?" I tried to step closer, but Emma held up a hand to stop me. "Don't," she said coldly. "I don't want to hear another word from you." The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. Emma turned on her heel and stormed out of the house, the sound of the door slamming behind her echoing through the silence. Laura sank onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "What have we done?" she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. I sat beside her, the enormity of the situation crashing over me. "I don't know," I said, my voice hollow. "But whatever happens now, we've destroyed something we can never fix." The days that followed were a blur. Emma refused to speak to either of us, her silence more painful than any argument could have been. Laura and I kept our distance, knowing that any attempt to reach out would only make things worse. Eventually, Emma filed for divorce. The process was cold and clinical, a stark contrast to the life we had once shared. She refused to see Laura, severing ties with her mother completely. The family we had built, the bonds we had thought unbreakable, were shattered beyond repair. As for Laura and me, we drifted apart, the weight of our choices driving a wedge between us. What had once felt like a connection born from shared loneliness now felt like a wound that would never fully heal. In the end, we were left with nothing but the memories of what we had lost and the scars of the choices we had made. The love we had betrayed, the trust we had destroyed, it all became a reminder of the fragility of human relationships and the devastating consequences of crossing forbidden lines. The weeks after Emma's departure were like living in the aftermath of a storm, quiet, but not peaceful. The echoes of the confrontation haunted the house, and I couldn't escape the suffocating weight of what I had done. Emma's absence was a constant reminder of my betrayal. The apartment, once filled with her laughter and energy, now felt hollow, as though the life had been drained from it. Laura and I didn't speak much after that night. The few times we saw each other, at family events or by chance, were strained and awkward. The connection that had once burned so brightly between us had turned to ash, consumed by the fallout of our actions. It wasn't anger or resentment that kept us apart, it was the overwhelming guilt, the knowledge that our choices had destroyed something precious and irreplaceable. Emma had moved out completely, leaving me to sort through the remnants of our life together. Packing up her belongings was an exercise in self-inflicted pain. Every photo, every trinket, every piece of clothing was a reminder of the life we'd shared and the trust I'd shattered. As I boxed up her things, I found a letter she had written to me years ago, a simple note expressing her love and excitement for our future together. I sat with it in my hands for hours, consumed by regret for the choices that had led us here. Laura fared no better. Her relationship with Emma had been severed entirely. Emma refused to answer her calls or respond to her messages, and Laura confided to me once that the silence was unbearable. "She was my daughter," Laura had said, her voice breaking. "And I've lost her because of this." The loss extended beyond Emma. Family gatherings became tense and uncomfortable. Whispers and stolen glances filled the air, though no one dared to address the elephant in the room. People noticed Emma's absence and the strained dynamic between Laura and me, but they didn't ask questions, not openly, at least. One day, I decided to visit Laura. It had been weeks since we last spoke, and despite everything, I felt the need to see her. When she opened the door, her expression was unreadable. She stepped aside to let me in, and we sat together in the living room, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "How are you holding up?" I asked, breaking the silence. She let out a bitter laugh. "How do you think?" "I've lost my daughter, Mark. I don't know if I'll ever get her back." I nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "For everything. For what we did, for what it cost." She shook her head. "It's not just you. I made choices too. Choices I'll regret for the rest of my life." We sat in silence after that, both of us lost in our thoughts. There was nothing left to say, no words could undo the damage or erase the pain. Eventually, I stood to leave, and as I reached the door, Laura stopped me. "I don't think we should see each other anymore," she said, her voice steady but filled with sadness. "It's the only way we can begin to move forward." I nodded, knowing she was right. "Take care, Laura." "You too, Mark," she replied, closing the door behind me. That was the last time I saw her. In the months that followed, I tried to rebuild my life. I threw myself into work, hoping the distraction would help me forget. But the memories lingered, refusing to be buried. Every time I saw a happy couple on the street or a family laughing together, I was reminded of what I'd lost and of the pain I'd caused. Emma and I finalized our divorce quietly. She didn't look at me during the proceedings, her focus fixed firmly ahead. When it was over, she walked out without a word, leaving me alone in the sterile courtroom. I sat there for a long time, the weight of finality pressing down on me. Life went on, but it wasn't the same. I learned to live with the guilt, though it never fully went away. I avoided family gatherings, unable to face the whispers and knowing glances. Laura disappeared from my life completely, and while I sometimes wondered how she was, I knew reaching out would only reopen old wounds. The most painful part was the silence from Emma. She had been my partner, my confidant, and the person I thought I'd grow old with. Now she was a stranger, her absence a void I didn't know how to fill. In the end, I was left with the harsh reality of my choices. I had crossed a line I never should have approached, and the consequences were devastating. I lost my wife, my family, and a part of myself I would never get back. The weight of those choices would stay with me forever, a constant reminder of the fragility of trust and the cost of betrayal. Months turned into years, and though life moved on, the scars of my choices never truly healed. Emma was gone, and so was the life we had built together. The apartment where we had shared laughter, dreams, and even arguments felt like a relic of a past life. I eventually moved out, unable to bear the weight of the memories that lingered in every corner. Laura and I stayed true to our decision to cut ties. She remained a distant figure, a shadow in my thoughts. Occasionally, I would hear about her through mutual family acquaintances, how she was doing, whether Emma had reconnected with her, but I never sought out more than that. Some wounds were best left undisturbed. Emma, too, moved forward with her life. I heard through the grapevine that she had started a new job in another city, and eventually, I learned she had begun seeing someone new. The news was bittersweet. While I wanted her to find happiness, the thought of her building a new life without me was a constant reminder of what I had lost. For a long time, I grappled with the why of it all. Why had I let my loneliness and vulnerability push me into such a destructive situation? Why hadn't I turned to Emma, to my partner, when I began to feel disconnected? These questions haunted me, but the answers always seemed to evade me, lost in the haze of guilt and regret. Eventually, I sought therapy, a step I had resisted for far too long. Sitting across from a compassionate stranger and laying bare my mistakes was excruciating, but it was also the first step toward understanding. I learned to confront my choices and acknowledge the pain I had caused, both to others and to myself. I realized that my actions hadn't just been about loneliness, they had been about a deeper fear of inadequacy, of feeling unseen and unworthy. Through therapy, I began to rebuild myself. It wasn't about absolving my guilt, it was about learning to live with it, to carry it as a reminder of the boundaries I had crossed and the trust one had destroyed. I began to volunteer at a local shelter, finding solace in helping others. The act of giving back offered a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Over time, the sharp edges of my guilt softened. I didn't forget what I had done, forgetting would have been an injustice to Emma and Laura, to the pain we had all endured. But I learned to forgive myself, not as an excuse, but as a means of moving forward. If there was one lesson I took from it all, it was this: love and trust are fragile, and they require constant care. When cracks begin to form, ignoring them only allows them to grow. It's better to confront the discomfort, to have the difficult conversations, than to let silence and neglect create a chasm that might never be bridged. As I sat in my small, new apartment one evening, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the sun set, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The past was painful, and I would carry its lessons with me forever. But I also saw the possibility of a different future, one shaped not by mistakes, but by growth and understanding. I hoped Emma found the happiness she deserved, and that Laura, too, had found peace in her own way. As for me, I knew I had a long road ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to walk it, one step at a time. What would you have done in Mark's position? Could trust ever be rebuilt after such a betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more gripping stories like this one. Next week, uncover the shocking tale of a woman who discovers her husband's double life. It's a twist you won't see coming. Stay tuned.